The sixth console generation, predominantly with the PlayStation 2 console, would become a treasure trove of very interesting titles that would see release during that era. A lot of these unique concepts would come in the form of movie-inspired games that would take great leaps in terms of their ideas due to the technology of the time, as they were also able to replicate, even add new features that wouldn't have been seen in the films of old, almost to kind of give you a behind-the-scenes element to a lot of your favourite movies you used to watch growing up. Now, as we all know, if you look back even on previous generations with the likes of the Sega consoles with the Master System, the Mega Drive, even Nintendo consoles, there were a lot of movie inspired games, and let's just put it this way, I have played a lot of them growing up, and even more so in recent times. And in fairness, not all of them are great. If anything, they feel more like low budget entries, which take away from the actual quality of games that would have been released on those earlier consoles. They often just felt rushed. So when it comes to a lot of these games, you'd be expecting them to be a lot better, and in many cases they are, but there are a few that usually fall through the cracks and often fall under the same format with feeling a little bit rushed or just not well put together. But in saying that, the majority of the games, even with this one here, based on one of the most iconic James Bond movies ever, From Russia with Love, would actually be a very, very good title. Even though review wise in the magazines it got average to mixed reviews, but it's not until you play it you realise that it's a lot better than expected. While most Bond games up to that point were mainly first-person games due to the height of success with GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64, so it was a change of pace to revert or to try out the third-person perspective games and utilising the graphics capability of the PlayStation 2 itself. That is based off of the iconic 1963 film of the same name. But what's even more interesting with this here is that it utilises a majority of the scenes and environments that would have been in the original film. Now, due to legal reasons and during the development phase, there were certain elements that had to be removed, obviously, because they couldn't use them for whatever reason, which again, that's a whole different ball game. But it still brought enough about it that tried to reflect all of those elements seen in the film and did a really good job. And I think one of the highlights, even for me personally, was the fact that Sean Connery, the original actor, reprised his role for the voiceover in the game, but they used his likeness from his younger years in the films of that time. And it would be the first time that the actor would reprise his role after having left the series years prior in the early 80s, and would also be one of his first entries into the realm of video games to do voiceovers for. Another interesting fact in this, even if you do read articles and elements online, this game, right, is based off of From Russia with Love, but it also does add elements in that weren't particularly in that film itself, that would later be seen in other films with the likes of Goldfinger and Thunderball. They would introduce the Aston Martin DB5 and even the jetpack, as they weren't predominantly in that earlier film, but they would end up being here. They'd find a way to intertwine all of the gadgets and elements into it. And the plot follows a similar aspect of that of the film, where Bond has to infiltrate and literally try and stop a villainous organisation that will take you through many of the games, or even from the locations based on the film, where you have to sneak, you have to use weapons, take out enemies. You can engage both in weapons based or close quarters combat, where you can punch and kick and use a variety of different grapple and special moves in order to incapacitate your enemies. Now, I have to say, from my own time playing this, as I sat down to have a go at it, it's a really good game. It's funny, like, because even when I look back from my own personal point of view and even from my own experience, a lot of these games way back years ago I often overlooked, or I just didn't give the time of day, or even you'd see them in a game shop and you'd be tempted to give them a try, but for some reason you just didn't, because you were interested in obviously other games at the time. So for whatever reason, a lot of these games were just overlooked and just weren't really given the attention that they truly deserve. It's not until years later when you go back and in hindsight when you go to really give these games a go and you begin to realise, like, damn, these were really, really good. They're a lot better than I thought they were, and this is one of those exceptions. The level design is very good. The use of puzzles and gadgets and so forth is very reflective of that of the earlier type of films, which I think is really cool. But the fact is, even the voice acting is very, very well done. There's a really good sense and telling of the story that's based off of the film, and just even the action sequences for its time was top notch. The game does a very good job at trying to reflect and replicate all of those elements from that time period, but even the graphics themselves, I have to say, are among some of the best I've seen in a game on the PS2. And with the majority of movie inspired games that are out there, right, yes, it did get mixed reviews, but I would definitely go out on a limb here and say that this is definitely one of the best movie inspired games that I have played on pretty much any console. There's so many elements that's close to the original and does a really good job to maintain that cohesive element that gives fans ideally an interactive version of their favourite film that they are deeply involved with. So regardless of the reviews, and I usually do say this with most games, yeah, the reviews are one thing, and it does give you an idea or a format of what to base the game off, but there are a lot of games out there that the reviews simply don't do the games justice. The only way to know how good they are is to literally sit down and play them for yourself. That way then you can make your own assumptions and decisions. And for me personally, this game was a lot better than expected. The fact that it mixes so many different gameplay elements, from stealth, which I love in games, being able to sneak around and even using puzzles and trying to figure out where to go, and backtracking elements where you have to find something to unlock something else in order to proceed. I love all of that within games, and this game does have that, make no mistake. Even with all of the unique elements that's available, it does have an offline multiplayer option, so if you want to play like deathmatch with your mates and stuff. I think that was a thing with the likes of these 007 games, especially when you look at the huge success of GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64 way back in the day. I remember a brother of mine had it on the console itself, and we would just play the game for ages. The multiplayer was a blast, and that one of the best multiplayer games honestly I've ever played, and quite rightly so. So I think it was a feature that would inevitably be added into later games, but whether they're as good as that in the original GoldenEye, well, that remains to be seen. It is what you make of it at the end of the day. But what really is cool is the unique mix of the gadgets and the weapons that you have at your disposal throughout each of the missions, as there are certain characteristics and qualities about each that you need to use, but there's certain agendas and objectives that will require you to use those devices, and you can't move forward until you have figured out how to use them and what to use them on. So the game really gets you to think about all areas of how to complete all of the objectives, which I think is really cool. It's not just a simple case of just running and gunning. You have different approaches to the gameplay, and you choose pretty much how you want to play the game, which I like in games anyway, and that's where you can have the most fun. So it's an interesting game, and not only was it released on the PlayStation 2, it also got ports on the Nintendo GameCube, the Xbox, and even with the PSP during that time as well. In saying that, the PSP version was slightly scaled down, where there were certain elements or levels that would have been removed, even with the likes of the driving levels or mini games, which if that was a feature that you enjoyed in this game, you probably won't see it in the handheld version, but it is what it is. You just made use with the version you would have had at your disposal. Some people will like it, some people loved it, some people probably not so much. It is what it is, but for those that do enjoy it, will remember it for what it did represent. It's a good solid game, a very good alternative to a very iconic movie that's well put together, and yeah, it's one definitely to look out for and try if you haven't played any of the Bond games. I would definitely recommend you give this one a go. But even though I think this game is cool, I'd love to know your thoughts. What did you think of it overall? If you played the game yourself, and are you a fan of the Bond franchise? And if so, what are your favourite movies, even which is your favourite game out of all the Bond games that have been released over the years? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you want to see more interesting aspects and gameplay of other Bond games similar to this that were also released on the PlayStation 2 over the years, then you can check out this playlist here on screen.